special guest here. We had over 300 people attend. We had scholars from all over the world. I think it was the first scholarly conference held at a university about a graphic novel. This year is the 35th anniversary of the publication of The Contract with God, which, as Paul Levitt said, is kind of where the lightning struck with graphic novels. We have some of our own lightning here today with Jeff Smith, who's going to talk about Will. But first, I'm going to let Mr. Dennis Kitchen, who's Will Eisner's friend, editor, publisher, and really they were deeply close. Dennis is going to introduce Jeff in a couple of minutes, but first, I wanted to say that we have some amazing sponsors for this. The Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at the university, the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, where I teach classes on the history and aesthetics of comics. The Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies is also a sponsor. The Department of Architecture and Art History also sponsored this lecture, which of course is appropriate because, as we know, comics are art. Okay. The Department of English, because comics are also literature. The Organization of Graduate Students in Comparative Literature also helps sponsor. The Institute for the Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, partly in honor of Mr. Eisner and his contributions to Holocaust and memory and his amazing work, The Plot, The Secret History of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The University Museum of Contemporary Art. Wait, comics are art, aren't they? At the University of Massachusetts. 5 Colleges, Inc. And we also had a wonderful event this morning at Hampshire College, so this is really a 5-college event. And the School of Cognitive Science and the Program in the Humanities at Hampshire are also sponsors, as well as the Department of English at Mount Holyoke College, which will be offering a graphic novel course for the first time this spring. So thank you to all of our sponsors for helping bring Jeff Smith to campus. And let's welcome Mr. Dennis Kitchen.
Hello. As Chris said, I had the privilege of working with Will Eisner for about 30 years. When I started in the business, I was a cartoonist. I became a self-published cartoonist, and eventually pretty much primarily a publisher, which is how I came to work with Will. And I love the fact that he was not just an amazing cartoonist and writer, but he also was an amazing businessman. So that was something that we had in common. It's not that common, frankly, for cartoonists to have the left brain, right brain thing working together. And in 1991 or 92, I was at a comic convention with Will. We were promoting one of his new works. Kitchen Sink Press, by the way, was in Northampton, a few miles from here, so Contract with God has local roots as well. So we're at this convention in 91 or 92, and when Will wasn't signing books at the table, he was off wandering, and he came back excitedly to our table. And he said, "There's a young artist here you gotta meet." And I said, "Sure, sure, bring him over. We're just happy to look at your talent." He said, "No, he's got his own table. You gotta come look at it." And I said, "All right, I will." He said, "No, right now." Jeez, Will, come on. How good can this kid be? So he brings me over to his table, and there's a young cartoonist named Jeff Smith, and he had, as I recall, 2 issues of Bone out at that time on the table, and I started flipping through them. It looked pretty promising. I love the style. I couldn't read it on the spot, but Will kept saying, "These are amazing." He said, "You gotta buy these." So I got my wallet out, I bought them, and I said, I'll check them out later. I was happy to meet him. Well, the rest is pretty much history. But one of the things that it turns out is another parallel is I had handed him a business card because 99% of the young cartoonists that I would meet at shows, they're looking for a publisher. And so I handed him the Kitchen Sink Press card, and I said, "It's great you're self-publishing, but it's a pretty tough gig." And I said, "When you're ready, maybe something good for your kitchen sink." And he said, "Well, for now I'm doing all right. Self-publishing, I might stick with it." And he has, and thanks in no small part to his amazing wife, Vijaya. The last I heard, that little self-published comic Bone has sold something like 16 million copies worldwide. So he didn't need a publisher after all. One last thing I want to mention is Will Eisner. Among other things, some of you may know there's an annual award named after him for excellence in comics. And his good friend Harvey Kurtzman also has an award named after him. So there's the Harveys and the Eisners. And they pretty much parallel each other in the categories, kind of like the Oscars you can imagine. They have best writer, best artist, best inker, best letterer, and so on. But the Harveys have one category that I personally love. It's called Best Cartoonist. And what that means, when they use the word cartoonist, is that somebody who does it all. He writes it and he draws it, and typically letters it, the whole ball of wax. And it's kind of like the auteur in film, who does it all. And so since the Harvey Awards have been given out in 1988, one artist has dominated it. Jeff has won that award 8 times. To me, that sums up really what he does. And not only is he the consummate cartoonist, man knows how to publish as well. So without any further ado, Jeff Smith.
Will Eisner was an inventive man. He's the son of Jewish immigrants, grew up in Brooklyn in the 1920s. And as we all know, Brooklyn in the 1920s was black and white. Almost literally. but even like the movies and magazines and the newspapers, they were all black and white. And you know, color really hadn't come in yet, except in one area. The newspaper, Sunday Comics. Pulitzer and Hearst were in the middle of a titanic newspaper war between the New York World and the New York Journal. The two of them were fighting back and forth, trying to woo readers, doing more splendiferous comics Sunday pages, and they even were poaching popular comics artists from each other. This is an example of one from the 20s, Gasoline Alley. It's a particularly stunning one visually, as far as, you know, but it's very gentle compared to most of the crazy stuff that was on these pages. And these pages are big. The newspapers were you held a newspaper page, it was like this. It was almost like a poster size. And each comic had its own page, and you could do whatever they wanted with it. This is an example of walking with Skeezix, just looking at the fall colors. But a lot of the comics were pretty zany and were aimed at, kind of like the immigrant population, or at least they made fun of them. So it's kind of impossible to overstate the impact that these pages had on the people of New York, or of the whole country. And I think Hearst didn't have the trouble. I have a quote from him here somewhere. Okay, so when he announced the color section of the journal when he was started, he dubbed it 8 pages of polychromatic effulgence that makes the rainbow look like a lead pipe. He was a subtle guy. So as these two fought, Hearst and Pulitzer, circulation soared. And one of the characters that kept getting stolen back and forth was Richard Alcall's Yellow Kid. He was this character was so popular, so well known. He was named Yellow because he had a yellow nightshirt on. That his name was used to describe the slanted journalism found in both the Pulitzer and Hearst papers. Yellow journalism. That's where it comes from the comics. Well, Eisner, as a young boy, growing up in the 20s and 30s, loved these pages. But not everyone was. Comics were aimed at the masses and often featured the anti-authoritarian misadventures of the immigrant classes. Those who considered themselves the protectors of society were alarmed. And this is a quote I found from, there's a book called The 10-Cent Play, which chronicles the long attack on comics, which started, this is from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1909, and continues even to this day. The article was titled Crime Against American Children, and published in January 1909. And it tore the Sunday supplements apart for undermining literacy and glorifying lawlessness and savagery. Now check this out. Are we parents criminally negligent of our children, or is it that we just have not put our minds on the subject of continuing to allow them to be injured by the inane and vulgar comic supplement of the Sunday newspaper? One thing is certain, we are permitting to go under our very noses and in our own homes extraordinary stupidity, and an influence for repulsive and often depraving vulgarity so colossal that it is rapidly taking on the dimensions of nothing short of a national crime against our children. Haters have been around for a long time. And that continued. That's gone on in comics for a very long time. Dennis Kitchen also founded an organization called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is a First Amendment organization. That was founded because comics, even to this day, are still prosecuted for, I don't know, for being vulgar junk. And I just recently joined the board, and I had my first meeting. That was good. But I'm actually pretty sensitive to these kind of things. But these attacks started right at the very beginning of comics, and I'm very sure Bill Eisner would have been aware of it. Because comics were just always disdained. They were, in fact, what I could already treat them. Will would have always been keenly aware of the disdain which comics were held in some quarters. Still, he said it was childhood aspirations. Comics were something I felt was within my grasp. Something I knew was part of my world, but something also that could take me out of that world, take me out of the ghetto. So Will must have been aware that people thought comics were cheap trash for kids that actually caused literacy, caused vulgar behavior. But he immediately didn't care and knew he wanted to get into it. The first comic books were reprints of popular comic strips from the newspapers. And as the public's appetite grew for these reprint books, they were really just reprints of Bringing Up Father or Blue Orphan or Popeye or whatever. But as the public's appetite grew, available material was starting to dry up. A lot of publishers started using rejected material, like stuff that people were submitting to syndicates but weren't good enough. But then these publishers were popping up all over Manhattan to gobble these kids up. And so Eisner figured, and there was probably a market for material that was created fresh, original, actually meant to be in a comic book. And he was one of the very first people to actually have that thought. And so in 1937, at the age of 19, Eisner, along with a former associate, Jerry Iger, set up the Eisner Studio, and they were early comics packagers, creating original comics content like Black Hawk, Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. They had a bunch of really kind of famous comic book people. I don't know if you'll have heard of them, but guys that worked for them got to cut their teeth in comics, like Nick Cardy, John Kirby, Lou Fine. And by all accounts, the atmosphere at the studio was one of camaraderie. And it turned out Will was right. New content was definitely all the rage, because the very next year, two other sons of Jewish immigrants from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, created the contents for Action Comics #1, which introduced Superman, a character that changed everything. I mean, comics suddenly had the thing that made them comics and not movies or books or pulps or anything else. And also the sales of comic books just took off into the stratosphere, hanging on to Superman's cape. Superheroes were what set comics apart, and the demand for it was insatiable. Within a year, Eisner was a wealthy young man, but producing content for these other comic book publishers wasn't really what didn't really excite him that much. He wanted to find comics that were more under his control, that he could do what he wanted. So when the Tribute Syndicate came to him and asked him to create a comic book, because comic books were so big. I mean, they were bigger than TV. I mean, like TVs now. They were huge mass media. The Tribune Syndicate wanted to get in on this comic books thing, so they came to him and asked him to create a comic book Sunday supplement that would go in the paper. And he made an agreement with them and sold his Eisner Studio to his partner and started up this paper. And he created the Spirit. This is the thing most of us comic book lovers know him for. They wanted, of course, they wanted to do a superhero, and he didn't want to do a superhero, so he created kind of like a Humphrey Bogart with a mask, and that was his costume. That satisfied him. But he basically was doing very pulpy, very hard-boiled noir stories with a kind of a supernatural bent to them sometimes. And his stories were brilliant. They had an O. Henry twist to them. They were full of sympathy and tragedy. And one thing that was really fun is he always played with the splash page. The logo was always crazy. And again, remember, these are big pieces of art. And there's no other color in your life. So you open up your newspaper and you're getting this giant poster of color. Here's a couple of quick shots just to let you see, that just the style of this inking was really thick and constructed. It was a bit cartoony, but it worked. It always conveyed what was going on in the story really well. Here's an example of just a double-page spread of how there were so few rules about comics back then that people like Eisner were free to invent them. So here he is playing with, he makes your eye follow the little word balloons that are almost floating like paper up in the air. And then he drops the guy, he gets shot in the second page and falls. And yet he just stops drawing panels and has the guy fall out of the comic. Eisner was drafted in the Army during World War II, and while he was there, he started up a comics-based instructional manual called Joe Dope for the Army. He'd revisit that model in the 50s with something called PS, Preventative Maintenance Manual. What's important to me, why I'm bothering to show you an Army manual that's made of comics, isn't that this is great comics. I don't even think Eisner thought it was great comics. What's important for where we're going today is that Eisner thought this was communication. He thought comics was a communications thing. He didn't think comics equals superheroes or funny animals. He thought it was a tool, and he's thinking that as early as World War II. And that's something that's kind of talked about in comics now. I mean, if you're taking any kind of course, you're going to have heard of Scott McCloud, who was totally locked into Mill's ideas in his book. Comics is sequential art. Is that the name of it? Yeah. So Will wrote a book on that also. So I just thought that was interesting. That that's what he was doing in the 40s and 50s. All right. So. All right, so now, and this is the point where the protectors of society are going to come back into our story here. The screed I read a minute ago was not the only one. There was lots and lots of voices saying, comics are not only a danger to our children, it's criminal, but it's a national disgrace. They cause illiteracy, they rot the brains. I mean, it was the closest thing I can even compare it to was like when there was so many attacks on the lyrics of hip hop songs, or what's happening now in the video game industry. They constantly, have people point their fingers at them. There was a shooting somewhere. It's not the NRA's fault. It's some kid playing a video game. Millions of kids play video games. One guy had all of them, right? But it's the same kind of. It was a hysteria. But with comics, it was bigger. It was the first thing of its kind. It was. It actually exploded into a huge deal where people wanted to get comic books banned. There were actual hearings in Congress where they were trying to say they were trying to prove that comic books caused juvenile delinquency. In order to survive, comics agreed to create its own censorship board, much as Hollywood had done 20 years earlier to stop policing books and make them safe for children. Now, no one asked the kids what they thought, right? They just asked themselves. And in fact, in the 60s, the kids were fed up with society's self-imposed rules, and that's when Robert Crumb and people like Dennis Kitchen got involved in the underground comics movement. This was kind of a crazy movement. It was a very hippie movement, but on some levels, right? But really, it was a pretty avant-garde political rebellion against the Ozzie-Harriet society, the white bread rules that everybody had to follow. And what you had then were a bunch of comics that were sex and rock and roll and drugs. And it's actually they're brilliant comics. I'm sure you guys have seen them. But there's something to behold. The imagination is let loose. It's during that time when Dennis Kitchen, I believe you searched out Will, got a hold of him. Is that how it happened? No? You want to give me a hint?
He, ironically enough, sought me out.
Oh, really? Okay, so well, that's interesting. So Will actually sought out Dennis. He sought out one of these. I know he looks like a nice, respectable, but he was really a dirty hippie. And he was. He knows it. But Will, okay, that's interesting. So Will must have seen what was going on in the underground and seen the freedom that they were experiencing and the experimentation that was going on. Sought out Dennis. Let's see, do I have a picture here? Oh, I do. And here you have Dennis. I believe that's drawn by Dennis and Will drawn by Will. And Will saying, it's stimulating to be working where there are few restrictions on subject matter, where freedom is challenging. Will actually kind of fit into the underground movement, or at least he came back to life. He was rejuvenated. I first saw Will in some books in the 70s that were starting to reprint them. Was it Erie? Who was publishing that? Was it Warren? Warren was publishing big oversized versions of them, of like Monster magazines and Family Row, but also Will Eisner books. And I was a 10-year-old kid, and that's where I saw them. I didn't know these things were already 30 years old. I just thought these were great comics where, you know, exciting things happened, and the drawings were so solid and good. So this leads, okay, so this kind of experimentation in freedom leads Will to start thinking about a project which he ends up calling a contracting guy. And it was, his idea was to write a piece that was, you know, had some weight, was literary, actually was about something, had a beginning and a middle and an end. It's actually 3 intertwined stories of people that live in this tenement building. The first of which is called A Contracting Guy. But he wanted it to be a book that would sit on the shelf with a spine, not be like a little magazine that was, you know, just meant to be read, rolled up in your pocket, and then, you know, thrown in the trash, or stored in the closet until your mom threw it away. He wanted a book. So he took his idea around to some publishers, and when they saw it was a comic book, they were dismissing. So he came up with the idea of using this term, a graphic novel. And there are other people that say they thought of it first, and maybe they did. But this is the one that stuck and actually worked. I'm not sure it opened to huge acclaim at the time, but it had a profound effect on a couple of comic writers, like Frank Miller, Art Spiegelman, Alan Moore. What they saw was a paradigm shift, a movement where a long, serious story could be told, and in a new way, without all the little boxes that said, you know, go over. Oh, meanwhile, like Commissioner Gordon's office, we don't need that. We just go to the new place. This is a single panel, which has this father yelling, "No, you cannot do this to me. We have a contract." This is a page from Contract that I particularly like. He's grabbing the curtain here. He says, "If God requires that men honor their agreement, then is not God also so obligated?" And the power in this image is amazing to me. First of all, there's no panel borders, you know, the squares. They're just gone. And I think that just lets the image escape and move so quickly right into each other. I mean, here he is. He's standing on the panel on the bottom. I mean, we know he's not literally standing on top of the window. That's the next panel. But that's how quickly these images are all bleeding into each other. And this morning I reread this while I was looking this over, and I looked at the lightning window, and it's negative. Instead of a black sky with white lightning, he made a white sky with black lightning. And for some reason that hit me in a weird way this morning. And I'll tell you why. Because when he did the introduction for his last version, I think it was in 2001, of Contract with God, Will talked about sort of what was behind him emotionally when he was writing this book. And he'd had a teenage daughter that had died. And so some of that emotion was like, ripping out of Will, and it rips out of these pages. And I haven't looked at this page since I really thought about that element behind the story. And all of a sudden, the world being, what's white is black and black, that lightning flash would be negative, suddenly struck me as almost like something that would just go right, in between your eyes, and the world is something broken. This is me with a mullet. This is Will Eisner in the middle, and Sergio Aragones, the genius behind Mad Magazine's little tiny Panama doodles. Well, I skipped ahead here, that's all right. I first met Will, I wrote to him. I met him at Ohio State University. He came and did a talk, much like I'm doing today, for a cartoon class I was taking there. And he was very nice. In fact, I met him twice at events like that. Well, when I started to do my first issue of Bone, I finished the first issue of the comic and began to figure out how am I going to actually get this published. I called, there was one of the comic distributors, Diamond, used to have a local regional warehouse near me in Columbus. So I called there and just said, is there anyone there who can talk to me? I told him who I was. I'm just a kid wanting to do a comic and tell me anything. She said, sure. I met with her. And one piece of advice she gave me was, she gave me some phone numbers for printers that do comic books. So that was a great thing right there. That alone would have been worth it. But instead, she also suggested, if you know any comic book artists, send them a copy of this book, because she saw them, I brought that with me, my Xerox copy of my comic. She said, if you know anybody, maybe they can give you a little quote or whatever or something, and you can put it in the catalog that you send out for retailers to order from. And I thought, well, I met Will Eisner once. I knew I loved him. I knew that I thought he was one of the best comic cartoonists. I had no idea that there were Eisner Awards named after him. I had no idea he was one of the gods of the pantheon of comics. I just liked his stuff, and I had a connection. I had the school actually, made sure it was okay with Will first, but then gave me his address, and I sent him a copy. And he sent me back a very nice note, a fairly long note, saying awesome blurbable things over and over about, good luck, keep going on your drawing like Kelly and Harriman. And at the end of it, he put a little asterisk that says, you can use any of this you want for a blurb. And I did. I milked that for all of it. I still have it. In 1986, the three guys I talked about, Frank Miller did a book called Dark Knight Returns. Alan Moore and David Gibbons did Watchmen. And Art Spiegelman published the first volume of Mouse with Pantheon. 1986. Lightning might have struck in 1978 when Eisner wrote Contract with God, but the big bang was in 1986. That blew the heads off of everyone in comics. We could not believe what was possible, not only in terms of art. These guys were all telling, even though Frank was using Batman, he was using Batman in bad ways that no one had ever done before. It was totally, this is what Frank wanted to do. And obviously Mouse was a very personal biography and autobiography of his father. And Watchmen was equally an idiosyncratic view of the world that Alan used a bunch of characters for. And then that book, in turn, was read by guys like me and Neil Gaiman. He went on to start doing long form comics in the 90s. Graphic novels, long form. Nice tie, though. That's another picture, a different, this is about 10 years later. Again, me and Sergio and Will, but in front are Dan DiCarlo and his wife Josie. They had just won a Reuben Award for comic books for his work doing Archie. And Josie who I had not met before, was actually who he based Josie and the Pussycats on. So that was kind of nice. Somehow, Will and Sergio and I, we were the comic book guys, so we were always kind of hung out together. This was a panel from July. Paul Levitz, the publisher, former publisher of DC Comics and also a comics historian, organized a panel for the same purpose as this, to celebrate the 35th anniversary of Contract with God. And on that panel were, from left to right, Neil Gaiman, Dennis Kitchen, Scott McCloud, and myself. And it was actually a really wonderful panel to be a part of, hearing everybody talk about it. All of us had very personal interactions with Will. Dennis's, of course, go back very far. But Neil brought up a really good point. Before I bring up Neil, I just want to say something about Scott. Scott McCloud is totally the guy who speaks the language, the academic language. I knew Scott when he was writing that book. I used to sit in bars with him at some convention, and he would hold forth till 2 in the morning. And my hair would be blown straight back. He's amazing. But it's Will who really started that academic science with his book, Comics and Sequential Art. And Scott totally acknowledges standing on his shoulders. But what Neil Gaiman brought up was that Will had this sense of collegiality, that he wanted us, the younger, the current generation at the time, to treat each other like respect, and to help each other, and to share stories, and to help each other get further up. And when Neil said that really struck home to me, because sure enough, I'd had conversations like that with Will, where he was like, you have to do the right thing and help people out and pay it forward. And of course, Neil was famous, popular long before I was, and he was very helpful to me, always giving me a hand and dropping the name alone in places. And I now do the same thing. I do my best to drop names and promote newer people and pass it along. So, in conclusion, the world of comics that we live in would have been very different without Contract with God or without Will. Today, graphic novels are the fastest and possibly only growing part of the entire book field, not just comic books as well. We can go to any bookstore, independent or big box, order the latest New York Times bestselling graphic novel online, even go to libraries and schools and find shelves dedicated to the art form. Will was present at the birth of comic books as one of the very few who believed that they were art at the time when they were universally condemned. He helped inspire the first generation of independently minded underground cartoonists, pioneered the academic discussion of the field, and successfully published the first graphic novel. The Eisner Awards, held every year in conjunction with Comic-Con International San Diego, are a respected symbol of quality. Eisner continued to create work into his 80s, spreading his own boyish love of comics to each young cartoonist that he met. Will Eisner was an inventive man. Thank goodness. For me, for Neil Gaiman, for Alan Moore, Scott McCloud, Paul Pope, Frank Miller, and hundreds of cartoonists who are now or will create, draw, and dream in this field of graphic novels. The book that showed us the way was A Contract with God, published 35 years ago this very month. Thank you.
I think the audience should ask any questions that they like, and it can be about Vassal or Bone or Contract with God or anything else that you might be interested in the world of comics. So Jeff's willing to answer questions.
I guess my question is more actually, I apologize, but more about kind of his tenement style. I was wondering if
Absolutely.
Kind of,
Totally perfect.
I feel like, and especially in Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, I think that's a very kind of essential thing to him, where like a lot of people in one house kind of are having these intertwined problems, and I was just kind of wondering if that was like his kind of, something that you also take into your writing as well.
The question is, well, he observation that Will's tenement style, a lot of his personal work was based around the tenements in Brooklyn or the Bronx. And then, he grew up in Brooklyn in that time when large families, lived in very small spaces and right next door to other large families. And so you could always smell what everybody else was cooking and hear what everybody else was yelling about. And I'm sure that informed Will quite a bit. And I think his best stories are that Contract with God is three different stories that are semi-intertwined that all take place in the same building. And it bleeds that sense of people packed together and their lives all rubbing up against each other. And as far as seeing that in Sandman and Neil Gaiman's work, yeah, I suppose it would. I mean, I know Neil loved Will's stuff, and I'm sure some of those energies I was just describing, you can see that and try to put that in there.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Anybody else?
I have a question just about your process in the past. How old were you when you first established Bone and the characters in Bone and the story? And how long and how much commitment did it take before you saw it gain the traction that led it on its path to where it is?
Yeah, okay, good question. How long did it take before Bone, how long did it take to kind of get it to be real? And then once it was real, how long did it take before it knew it wasn't going to die? How long did it take to get traction? That's a great question. I think it was in 1986, the year I described as the Big Bang
And
for
how
graphic
old
novels.
were you then?
I was 26 in 1986. I was born in 1960. So I grew up with the Beatles and the Monkees and Star Trek and comic books. That was my thing. And I lost interest in comics in the 70s. Girls. But I heard about Malice and Dark Knight. They were actually getting so much attention. They were being written about in magazines and newspapers, and actually sought out a comic book store, and I found it. And there I found the comic book stores in 1986 were worse than the way they're portrayed on The Simpsons. I mean, they all had a cat that was sleeping on their piles of comics. And, the guy was still the same. Who wouldn't get off this store. But there were bongs and porn and tattoo books and things. But somewhere in between all this stuff, there was a rack of these comics. And in 1986, I saw the Hernandez brothers. I saw Peter Bagge. I saw Dan Clowes. I saw later I would see the Tick. I saw Cerebus. I was like, what is this? What is going on? I couldn't believe my eyes. And I just grabbed all this stuff. I bought all these books. I went home and I read them, and I couldn't believe it. I really wanted to do Bone as a newspaper comic strip. That was what I wanted to do. But I couldn't sell it to save my life. It was a complete failure as a newspaper strip. But here, comics were alive. And the talent with the Hernandez brothers and Sim and all these guys, this was better than the best golden age, or equal to the golden age of the newspaper strips, I thought. It was so, and I ran back to the jail, and I owned an animation studio at that time. I was fairly successful. I mean, we were paying our rent and eating. And I said, I want to sell my animation studio and do Bone as an underground comic. She took it pretty well. But she said, you have to write a business plan. And that's really important. We can talk about that later, because that did kind of help me figure out the directions, what steps to take. But from that time, that moment that I knew I wanted to do it, it took me, I don't know, about 3 years to kind of go to the comic book shop and buy comics and kind of familiarize myself with what comic books are anymore. They're self-published ones that don't come out of them. They're black and white. They're not in color. They're underground. Excuse me. And then I started working on a business plan, and that took about 6 months or so. including getting some money from the bank. And then I actually did. I sat down, I drew that first one on our kitchen table, sent a copy to Will Eisner. Somehow that worked. I can't fucking believe it even now. He sent me that letter. And the first issue came out, and it made exactly enough money to pay the print run. I think I sold like 1,100 copies or something, which was the number. Like the J is watching, and she's watching the invoice coming in. Because if it was 10,000, then I didn't make it. I had to at least make money. And I think the second one made a little bit more money, and then they started to drop again. And I think the fourth issue had dropped probably 9,000. Now we're actually not paying the printing bill. And the only reason, I had two agreements with it. Well, I had actually, one was write a business plan. The second one was, I would only do this for a year. I would do 6 issues of Bone. If it didn't work, if we didn't have some reason to think this was going to work, I would stop and I would go try to get a job at Disney. But the fourth issue, we weren't going to cover our print run, but there was a little tiny article in the back of the Comics Journal in there, what's new to pick. They said the number 4 is supposed to come out, and we really like the first 3, so check that out. Nothing much, just a little something. And then Don and Maggie Thompson, you remember Don and Maggie, they were wonderful. This kind of silly old nerd couple that were really into sci-fi and comics fandom, and were part of the creation of comics fandom. We had a newspaper a weekly newspaper called the Comics Buyer's Guide, and that was a pretty important magazine in the 80s and 90s. Because they came out weekly, and there was no internet, so people couldn't talk and bitch about comics all day. So they could write in letters and bitch about it and back and forth, and every week you go, oh, what's Peter David going to say to that? and so it was a very active live center of comics. And I remember going to a retailer show, and I set up, it was the first show I ever went to. I'd been doing one for about a year. I think I had, not even a year, I had 3 issues of it. And somebody told me that Diamond has this exhibition for just retailers. No, the public's not allowed, artists aren't allowed, it's just retailers and the publishers. And I said, I'm a publisher, and I got a booth, and I got an easel, just a little easel, and I drew a big drawing of Bone, and I clipped the original art around the edge, because that was kind of colorful. I painted it with airbrush. And I jumped in a car and I went to the show. And it was pretty good, because all the DC and Marvel, they're there with much more impressive displays, but they didn't bring any talent with them. They didn't bring the cartoonists. It's just Bob Wayne in a suit, which is Bob Wayne's a nice guy, but you know, I was over there. Here's my comic, and I'm drawing pictures for the retailers, and they loved it. They were talking to me, and pretty soon I had a crowd around me, and I look up, and I see Don and Maggie Thompson come around the corner of this aisle, come toward me. I can see that they spotted my booth, and they actually looked at each other, took each other's hands, and walked like little kids. Not being funny, because they just were really that way. And they loved Bone, because they're big Walt Kelly fans, who was one of my heroes. And the very next issue of the CBG had a 2-page spread where they read pages of Bone. They just glowed over. And that was the moment where I had a feeling it was possible. It was possible. And the JA said, okay, you can have a couple more issues to see. You can go to your 6 now. And then things turned around, I think, with number 8. That's when I went to WonderCon, which used to be the first important show of the year out of Melbourne. And everybody, you have to go. So if you're getting the idea of going to comic book shows, if you're interested in comics, it is important. It's got to be part of your life. It's where your tribe is. They move around all year, and they're all in the same place, and they're waiting for you to have a pizza and a beer. But I would go out there, and I remember going to hang out in the lounge with some retailers, because that's what I do first. And at the same show, within like 10 minutes of each other, Frank Miller came up and clapped me on the back. Said, "Great job, Jim." And 5 minutes later, Neil Gaiman came over, and he had gotten an award at the show earlier that night, I think. And I was like, "Congratulations on the award." And he looked at me and goes, "You're going to get a piece of wood next year, man. You're taking one home." And I was just like, "Wow." And shortly after that, I did the Greg Cowray storyline, which is a story in and of itself. But it worked, and my sales actually began to double exponentially every issue after that. And I could finally get the J and like stop dragging me toward the door. Well, that was a long answer. Yeah.
Most of the comic workers from that era seem very bitter now. What kept Will so optimistic? Was it being financially secure? Was that just his nature? What was it, being independent?
Bingo. A lot of the creators from that time period are bitter now, and that's true. A lot of them are. Why is it Will? And you say, because Will was independent. A lot of the guys, and many of them were geniuses, like Jack Kirby, who were toiling away for DC Comics and Marvel Comics and Quality Comics or whatever you name it at the time, Fawcett. We're doing so with no insurance. You know, they had no pension plan. They were just getting paid a per page rate, which was actually kind of cruel, just to encourage them to do more and more and more. These guys practically had no lives. I mean, they had wives and kids, and then they would have dinner and run down to the basement to the drawing board. And a lot of them, especially Kirby is a great example. I mean, he watched the company, Marvel, get fabulously rich on the characters that he was making up and cranking out, you know, in the most uncomfortable way. So, a lot of the guys were like that. At least Kirby was adored. You know, a lot of the guys just worked their butts off, and nobody knows who they are to this day. But Will, that moment when he was making a bunch of comics for other people to publish, the fresh material he started. The moment he left there, the reason he left there was when the Tribune Media Syndicate, the Tribune Syndicate came here and said, "We want to get in on this comic book boom. We want a comic book session in the newspaper." He said, "I'll do it, but I have to have control over it. I have to have creative control, and I have to own the copyright." The copyright story is slightly more complicated, but he definitely ended up with the copyright, and that is a big part of it. And that's a lesson I learned. My heroes, Will Eisner, Walt Kelly, they owned their comics. I mean, I used to read Walt Kelly, and at the end of every Pogo strip, there was his name in a box with a circle C. And I looked that up, and I'm like, "Oh, well, Walt Kelly owns his comics, I'm going to own them." So I've always owned my own comics, and I'm sure that's why Will. I mean, Will still owns the Spirit. I mean well, obviously doesn't. You know what I'm saying. But he was able to find that the contract with God new homes when the other publishers went out of business or didn't want it anymore. He owned it. He was able to control it and take it where he wanted. It was with Dennis for a long time, and then Dennis arranged, I believe, to have DC start to reprint it because DC could take it over forever. So that is the power of owning and controlling your own work, and that's being independent or self-publishing. Yes?
Hi, kind of piggybacking off of that last question, I want to know if you could talk about your experiences with like self-publishing and creating Bone, and then contrasting that with your work with DC when you did that Captain Marvel.
Okay, yeah. Well, since I've just shot off my mouth about how important it is to be independent and creative, you say, would you contrast the experience of making Bone and doing Shazam, the Monster Society of Evil for DC? Yeah, you know what? It was very fun. I did not have a bad experience, so I don't have any the editors screwed me kind of a story. I finished Bone. It took me 12 years to do Bone. Graphic novels take a very long time. It was 1,300 pages. I knew it had a single story, a beginning, middle, and end before I started. I wrote the ending first. And Rassel, my new book, which is kind of a short story, it's only 500 pages. That took me 5 years to do. So if you're interested in this field, it takes time to do comics. It doesn't have to take that long, but it at least takes a year or two to do a book. It took me 12 years to do Bone, and when I was getting done, and almost everybody in comics, including the people at DC, knew I was going to do it again. And they called me and asked if I wanted to work on any superhero comics. And I said, like who? To be honest, if they had said Superman, I wouldn't have wanted to. I don't have anything to say about Superman. And if they had said Flash or the I'd be like, fuck, me? Who cares about those guys? But they said Captain Marvel. And that just struck me correctly. That to me was, this was a character that was almost as old as Batman and Superman, and had not been really changed or altered in any significant way since the golden age of comics, since the 1940s. So, and he was actually still kind of goofy and square. And he had a talking tiger. So the whole thing, I was just like, you know what? This kind of goes up my alley, and his powers are coming from, the Shazam are like the initials, it's an acronym for like, for Solomon and Hercules and Atlas and Zeus. And I can't remember the last name, Mercury is one of them. And so it's mythology, which was, there's a ton of mythology involved. So I actually thought this might be fun. They wanted me to relaunch Captain Marvel, kind of reimagine him and start a new series, start with the #1 and go. And I didn't want to do that. I thought I would like to do a short project, like just do like a 4-issue miniseries and have an ending, and then I'm done, and that's it. And they agreed to it. They asked me if I would write it all first, and my scripts don't look like screenplays. They look like little miniature comics, little mini comic pages. But they have the words in them. You can read them and tell it's going on. So I sent that to DC. They approved it. And then I spent the next 2 years, drawing it. And it's a superhero comic. It's fine. I know a lot of people that really, really like it. And I know there's a bunch of DC fans that thought I was goofy and stupid. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. And it helped me emotionally get out from the shadow of Bone. Bone was a big deal, and it was, for me especially, I've been drawing that style, thinking that way for so many years. It was good for me to stop and work on a character that I didn't know, had no real illusions about, for a short period to just relax and work out the kinks. And it was, I described it as a palate cleanser. It was just, let me get, so then I was able to get on with the rest. I know I didn't know any of it, so I didn't invest my heart and soul.
So we're all pretty fortunate enough to have courses and talks like this where we can experience graphic novels, like kind of like or other ones on an academic level. Where something like 10 Cent Play or a lot of other places talk about how detrimental it can be to learning, but people that read comics and write comics know that that's really not true. So I wanted to sort of see what you thought, where comics can fit into this primary and secondary education field, and sort of in the learning, reading, and writing process, and how maybe that can better students that have learning disabilities or things like that.
Right. That's a heavy question. Let me I'll repeat it first. He's just saying that, here we are, we're fortunate enough to have classes, and academia is very much embracing, or is in that process of embracing comics. But there are still a lot of people who think that it causes illiteracy, like some kind of a disease or something. Librarians are pretty much on board. A lot of elementary school teachers are getting on board. But personally, when I was a kid and that kind of stuff was being said, and it was. And you knew comics were junk that the grown-ups didn't like. That's kind of why we liked them. But I also knew they were junk, and I knew that because of literacy. I learned to read because of comics. I learned to read because my dad would read me Peanuts on Sunday, and then I got a little paperback book when my dad wasn't around during the week, and I had to learn how to figure out what Snoopy and Linus were talking about. So I learned to read because of comics. And I didn't just only read comics. I went on to read real books. So, but then the question was, oh, and I want to make sure I didn't give you the wrong impression. The book, The 10-Cent Play, which I highly recommend, is not a book that actually thinks comics are a 10-cent play. It's parodying that. It actually talks about how awesome comics were, and it just talks about the incredible attack that just was relentless from the minute they appeared in the newspapers all the way up until they nearly crippled comics in the 50s when the comics started. Then the second part of this question was, how can I speak to comics working in classrooms with kids that have either learning disabilities or are reluctant readers? And to be honest, I know that's happening, and I know that that's actually kind of fueling not only comics in the classroom, but is helping my back book. Because Bone is a very popular book with reluctant readers and kids. But I am not a teacher, and I didn't design it in any way for that. So I have no understanding of why it works, except I can make an educated guess as a cartoonist and as a kid who once read comics. I think comics, there's that picture of the character is right there with his word board, and he's thinking what he's saying. And even if another character is thinking something else and saying something else, you get this. Spiegelman uses the term short worded picture bursts. So there's a very concentrated moment of time in this panel. It's possible that someone could be more excited to understand what's going on because they can see what the characters are thinking and doing and then connect the words to it. There's all sorts of grammar in comics. There's a syntax between panels. There's, you just read Scott McCloud and you're crazy. But I'm sorry, that's the best answer I have. I don't know why I love reading comics, except that I do.
So shall we just take one more question?
At what point does a comic become a graphic novel, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it should be the work of a single. It should be the work of an author. It could be a team that works really in tandem well, but they should have a singular vision, a voice that's unique to that person or that team. And I think it should have a beginning and a middle and an end. I believe it should have a structure. That's a literary structure that goes way back. And I think just taking collections of, random X-Men books or Iron Man and putting them out is not a graphic novel. That's just a collection it's an anthology of stories. So I think it should be a book that actually functions like a book. It should have an arc to the story. So that would be my definition of it. All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much for